My name is Zoya. Today, I live in a mansion, drive luxury cars, and have everything people dream of. But behind this gold and silk lies a secret that keeps me awake. People see my success and envy me. But they don't know that my life is built on a debt I can never repay. My peace is gone because I am living a life that was chosen for me, not by me. My story began 10 years ago when I had nothing. I was an orphan with no family to turn to. On a freezing winter night, as heavy rain hammered against my broken window, I sat in the dark. I had no money for rent, and the landlord had threatened to throw me out. Hunger and cold had broken my spirit. I felt like the world had forgotten I existed. I was ready to give up. Suddenly there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find Aryan standing there, soaked to the bone. He ran a small grocery shop at the end of my street. We had never spoken more than a few words, but he handed me a bag of food and some cash. He said softly, "Zoya, I know you are struggling. Please take this. Think of me as a brother." I stared at him in shock. Why would a stranger show such kindness? His eyes were full of genuine compassion. That night he didn't just give me food. He gave me hope. But I didn't realize that this act of kindness would eventually become my golden cage. That one night started a journey that would lead me to wealth, but cost me my freedom. This was the beginning of a debt that would eventually demand my entire life in return. After that rainy night, everything changed. Aryan didn't just stop at one meal. He became my shadow and my protector. Every morning he would drop off milk and bread before I even woke up. When I finally found a job as a junior clerk, he was the one who bought me my first professional suit. He told me, "Zoya, you are destined for greatness. Don't let your past hold you back." His belief in me was the fuel I needed to keep going. I worked day and night, climbing the corporate ladder with a hunger that only someone who has been truly poor can understand. Every time I received a promotion or a bonus, I tried to pay Aryan back. I would go to his small shop with an envelope of cash, but he would always push my hand away. He would smile and say, "Keep it, Zoya. Your success is my reward. Just seeing you happy is enough for me." His selflessness made me feel a deep sense of loyalty. I started visiting his shop every evening. We would sit on small wooden stools drinking tea and talking about our dreams. He told me how he had lost his parents young too, and how he had worked since he was 10 years ago to keep that little shop running. I felt like I had finally found someone who understood my pain. Slowly, the town started talking. They saw the successful businesswoman visiting the poor shopkeeper. I didn't care about the gossip then. I felt safe with him. He was the only person who knew the girl who had once sat crying in the dark. But as my world grew larger and his stayed the same, a small gap began to form. I was becoming a different person, while he was still the man behind the counter waiting for me. I didn't realize that his kindness was slowly weaving a web around my heart. As the years passed, my career reached heights I never imagined. I moved from being a clerk to a senior manager in a top firm. I moved out of that small leaky room into a modern apartment. Every step of the way, Aryan was there. He wasn't just a friend. He was the foundation of my new life. He would fix my sink, help me move furniture, and listen to my work problems for hours. He was my rock, and I felt I owed him everything. One evening, I took him to a fancy restaurant to celebrate a major deal. He looked out of place in his simple clothes, and he was nervous about using the right forks. People at the next table whispered and stared. I felt a flash of embarrassment, but I quickly suppressed it. He saved me, I reminded myself. I should be proud to be with him. But the gap between our lives was becoming a canyon. I was talking about global markets, he was talking about the price of flour. At the end of the night, while we walked through a quiet park, the atmosphere changed. Aryan stopped under a street lamp and took my hand. His palms were rough and calloused. He looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Zoya," he said, his voice trembling. "I've watched you grow. I've loved you since the day I saw you shivering in that room. I don't have much, but I want to spend my life making sure you never cry again." My heart sank. I felt a cold wave of realization. I cared for him deeply, but I wasn't in love. I felt gratitude, not passion. But how could I say no? How could I reject the man who fed me when I was starving? To say no felt like a betrayal. I looked at his hopeful face, remembered that rainy night, and felt the weight of my debt. Yes, Aryan, I whispered. It was the first lie of my new life, and as he hugged me, I felt the cage door lock for the first time. The wedding was simple, just as Aryan wanted. I wore a beautiful dress, but I felt like I was putting on a costume for a play. While the guests cheered, I kept telling myself that love would come with time. He is a good man, I whispered to my reflection. He deserves this. After the wedding, I insisted he close his small shop. I wanted him to enjoy the luxury I had earned, to finally rest after years of hard work. But things didn't go as planned. Aryan struggled to fit into my world. He felt uncomfortable in my modern apartment and hated the fancy parties my colleagues threw. He preferred sitting on the floor rather than the expensive leather sofa. While I was busy leading meetings and making million-dollar decisions, he sat at home bored and lost. He began to feel like a guest in my life, and his insecurity started to show. He began calling me 10 times a day just to ask when I was coming home. If I stayed late for a business dinner, he would be waiting at the door with a sad, accusing look in his eyes. He didn't scream or get angry, he would just say, "I missed you, Zoya." I felt lonely. Those words were more painful than any shout. They reminded me that I was his entire world, while he was becoming a burden in mine. The guilt was suffocating. I started coming home early, missing important opportunities just to keep him from feeling neglected. Every time I looked at him, I didn't see my husband. I saw the man who gave me bread when I was hungry. I felt like I was paying back a loan every single day. I was no longer a partner. I was a servant to my own gratitude. The more he loved me, the more I wanted to run away. But the debt kept me pinned to the ground. As our marriage continued, my career reached its peak. I was now the CEO of my own design firm, and my name was in every business magazine. But at home, the silence was deafening. Aryan had become a shadow in our mansion. He didn't understand my work, and he felt intimidated by my success. Every time I tried to talk about my day, he would just nod and say, "That's great, Zoya. I'm just a simple man. I don't understand these big things." His simplicity, which I once found charming, now felt like a barrier. He refused to wear the designer suits I bought him, preferring his old, faded shirts. When my colleagues came over, he would hide in the kitchen or sit quietly in a corner, looking like a stranger in his own house. I felt ashamed of my own embarrassment. How can I feel this way about the man who saved me? I would ask myself in the mirror, tears stinging my eyes. The guilt turned into a heavy physical pain in my chest. To compensate for my lack of romantic love, I tried to buy his happiness. I bought him a luxury car he never drove and expensive watches that sat in their boxes. I realized that money couldn't bridge the gap between us. He didn't want things, he wanted the old Zoya, the girl who needed him. But that girl was gone. She had been replaced by a powerful woman who didn't need anyone. One night I found him looking at an old photo of his small grocery shop. His eyes were red, and he looked smaller than I remembered. "I was happy there, Zoya," he whispered. "I felt useful. Here I feel like a ghost." I reached out to touch his shoulder, but I pulled back. I couldn't even offer him a sincere hug. The debt of that first meal felt like a mountain between us, growing taller every single day. Months passed, and the tension in our house became a heavy fog. I began staying at the office later and later, inventing meetings that didn't exist just to avoid the guilt of seeing Aryan's waiting face. Every time I pulled into the driveway and saw the porch light on, my heart would tighten. I knew he was sitting there, dinner getting cold, waiting to hear about a world he no longer understood. One evening, I came home to find the dining table set with candles. Aryan had tried to cook my favorite childhood meal, the simple lentil soup I used to eat when I was poor. But the soup was burnt and the kitchen was a mess. He looked so defeated, standing there with a stained apron. "I wanted to remind you of the old days," he said softly, "before everything became so complicated." I looked at the burnt soup and felt a wave of anger I couldn't control. The old days were miserable, Aryan. I was starving and freezing. I snapped, my voice echoing in the marble hallway. The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. His face crumbled. He didn't argue. He just looked down at his rough hands. "I know," he whispered. "But back then you looked at me like I was your hero. Now you look at me like I'm a mistake." The silence that followed was worse than any scream. He was right. I was treating my savior like a burden. I walked over and forced myself to take a bite of the bitter, burnt soup. I told him it was delicious, but the lie tasted like ash. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. I realized that by trying to repay him with a life of luxury, I had actually taken away his dignity. I had turned my hero into a prisoner of my success. The guilt of that night weighed on me like a physical chain. I tried to be better, to be the wife Aryan deserved, but my heart refused to cooperate. Every time he touched my hand or kissed my forehead, I felt a shiver of discomfort. I started focusing entirely on my work, throwing myself into a new international project just to keep my mind busy. I traveled to different cities, staying in hotels where the silence didn't feel so heavy with expectation. One afternoon, I returned home early and found Aryan sitting in the garden, staring at a small patch of dirt he had cleared. He was planting seeds, simple vegetables like the ones he used to sell in his shop. His hands were covered in mud, and for the first time in months, he looked peaceful. "I need to feel the earth, Zoya," he said without looking up. "Everything in this house is so polished, so cold. I feel like I'm fading away." I stood there in my expensive silk suit watching him. I realized then that I had tried to change him into someone he wasn't. I wanted a husband who could stand by my side at galas, but he was the man who had stood by me in the rain. I felt a sudden urge to kneel in the dirt with him to find that girl I used to be, but I couldn't. That girl was dead, buried under years of ambition and corporate battles. He looked at me and asked, "Do you remember the park where we used to walk? The one where you told me you wanted to be with me always?" I nodded, my throat tightening. "I went there today," he continued softly. "The trees are taller, but the air felt the same. I sat on our bench and waited for you, even though I knew you were at work." His words were a knife to my chest. He was still living in our past while I was desperately trying to outrun it. A few weeks later, I received an invitation to a prestigious business gala. It was the event of the year, and as the CEO, my presence was mandatory. I looked at Aryan, sitting on the porch in his worn-out sandals, and felt a familiar wave of dread. I knew I had to ask him to come, but I also knew he would be miserable. "Aryan," I said, leaning against the doorframe, "there is a big event tomorrow. I would really like you to be there with me." He looked up, his eyes clouding with anxiety. He didn't want to go, but he saw the plea in my eyes, or perhaps he saw the guilt. "If it makes you happy, Zoya, I will go," he said quietly. I spent the next day arranging a custom suit for him, hiring a stylist, and trying to coach him on the people he would meet. I was treating him like a project to be managed, not a husband to be loved. I felt like a monster, but I couldn't stop myself. The night of the gala was a disaster. Aryan stood stiffly in his expensive tuxedo, looking like a prisoner. When my business partners tried to discuss international trade, he stood silent, clutching his glass of water. One man, a cruel competitor, leaned in and asked Aryan what he did for a living. Aryan looked at me, then back at the man and said honestly, "I used to own a small grocery shop. Now I just take care of our garden." The man laughed, a sharp, condescending sound. I felt my face flush with heat. I wanted to defend him, but I was frozen by my own shame. Aryan saw my expression, the flicker of embarrassment I couldn't hide, and his shoulders slumped. He didn't wait for the dinner to end. He turned and walked out of the ballroom without a word. I stood there, surrounded by lights and music, feeling more alone than I had ever felt in that cold, leaky room 10 years ago. I had finally broken his spirit. The silence that followed the gala was louder than any argument they had ever had. For days, Aryan didn't speak, and Zoya didn't know how to bridge the gap. Every time she looked at him, she saw the ghost of the man who had once been her anchor, now drifting further away. She had achieved everything she ever dreamed of, but her house felt like a hollow tomb. The realization began to sink in. She had climbed to the top of the world only to find that she had sacrificed the only person who truly loved her for who she was, not for her title or her bank account. One evening, Zoya returned home early, hoping to finally sit Aryan down and beg for his forgiveness. But the house was eerily still. The garden, which Aryan spent every afternoon tending to, looked neglected. She ran up the stairs, her breath catching in her throat, and pushed open their bedroom door. The custom suits she had bought him were all hanging in the closet, untouched. But his old worn-out bag, The one he had carried since their days in the leaky room was gone. On the bedside table lay a small handwritten note. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. It read, "Zoya, I realize at the gala that my presence is a shadow over your bright world. You worked so hard to escape the life we had. And I am the last piece of that life you are still dragging behind you. I don't want you to feel ashamed of your husband ever again. I am going back to where I belong so you can finally belong where you are." Tears blurred her vision as she realized the gravity of her mistake. She had spent years trying to change him, never realizing that his simplicity was the very thing that had kept her sane. Without a second thought, she grabbed her car keys and raced out of the house. She didn't head for the corporate district or the luxury shops. She drove toward the outskirts of the city, toward the narrow, crumbling streets where it all began, praying that she wasn't too late to bring him home. The rain lashed against the windshield as Zoya drove through the old neighborhood, the streets becoming narrower and the lights dimmer. Every corner she turned brought back a flood of memories: the bakery where they shared a single bun, the bus stop where they waited in the cold, and the small grocery shop Aryan once owned. She realized now that these weren't just memories of poverty. They were memories of a time when she was truly happy. She had traded her soul for a penthouse view, and now she was desperate to find her way back. She finally reached their old apartment building. It looked even more derelict than she remembered, the walls covered in moss and the roof sagging. She ran up the stairs, her expensive heels clicking loudly against the rotting wood. When she reached their old door, she saw it was slightly ajar. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pushed it open. The room was dark, smelling of damp earth and old dust. There, sitting on the floor in the exact spot where they used to dream of a better life, was Aryan. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo or a custom suit. He was back in his old faded shirt, looking smaller than ever. "Aryan," she whispered, her voice breaking. He didn't look up. "I looked at the garden tonight," she continued, stepping into the room. "And I realized that nothing grows there anymore because the person who gave it life is gone. I was so busy trying to make you fit into my world that I forgot you were the only reason I survived the old one." She knelt on the floor beside him, ignoring the dirt staining her designer dress. "I am so sorry. I was the one who was small, not you. My success made me blind, but losing you has made me see everything." Aryan finally looked at her. His eyes filled with a tired kind of sadness. "I didn't leave because I was angry, Zoya," he said softly. "I left because I didn't recognize you anymore. The woman I married loved the stars, but the woman I lived with only loved the spotlight." He reached out, his hand hovering near hers but not quite touching. "I can't go back to being a project. I just want to be a husband." Zoya took his hand, pressing it to her cheek, her tears finally falling freely. She knew that winning him back wouldn't be as easy as signing a contract. She had to prove that the CEO was gone, and only Zoya remained. Hello my friends, this was the first part of my story. To see the second part, make sure to subscribe to our channel, as part 2 of this story will be coming very soon. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any upcoming videos. See you in the next video. Goodbye.